Dr. Ethan McCall's boots hit the sterile, glowing floor of the Ksorr Medical Citadel with a dull thud, an unintentional but audible declaration of his presence in the otherwise silent corridor. Around him, Vraxxian medical staff paused to stare, their multifaceted eyes narrowing in a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Ethan adjusted the strap of the weathered duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the human-made diagnostic equipment inside clinking faintly. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to save a life and maybe prove a point while he was at it. Dr. McCall, this way, a tall Vraxxian nurse said in a clipped tone, her exoskeleton shimmering faintly in shades of blue. She led him through the halls, where translucent walls pulsed faintly with light, an eerie rhythm that seemed more alive than mechanical. The entire facility radiated technological superiority, and the weight of being a mere human in a place like this wasn't lost on Ethan. But he'd been underestimated before. They entered the conference chamber, where a group of Vraxxian physicians led by Dr. Vraxxian awaited him. Vraxxian stood out immediately. His exoskeleton gleamed in a sharp metallic gold, and the subtle shift to a dull orange as Ethan approached signaled irritation. Dr. McCall, Vraxxian began, his voice clicking slightly. Thank you for coming. Although I must admit, your presence here is unconventional. Ethan didn't flinch. Unconventional might be what you need right now. I hear you've got a situation no one can solve. Indeed, Vraxxian replied, his tone icy. The patient, Zrif, one of our senior government officials, is suffering from a systemic organ failure induced by a pathogen we've identified as variant 14 of the Yilthak bacteria. Despite our best efforts, the condition is irreversible. We've exhausted every avenue of treatment. Good thing I'm not one of your avenues, Ethan said, dropping his bag onto the sleek table. Several Vraxxians visibly recoiled at the scuffed human equipment. He began unpacking handheld scanners, a centrifuge, and a portable blood analyzer that looked almost barbaric next to the gleaming orb-like devices lining the room. Vraxxian's chitin shifted to a faint green. Annoyance. Your tools appear, how shall I put this, rudimentary. Ethan smirked. And yet, here I am. The room fell uncomfortably silent until a soft chime signaled the arrival of a holographic projection of Zrif's medical data. The rotating image showed a complex cascade of organ failure and biochemical chaos. Ethan studied it carefully. I'll need to see the patient, he said after a moment. Vraxxian's tone grew sharp. Everything you need to know is here in these diagnostics. Our AI has processed millions of potential treatments. None were viable. Yeah, well, maybe your AI isn't as smart as it thinks it is, Ethan shot back. Sometimes your machines only find what they're programmed to look for. Biology doesn't always play by your rules. Vraxxian's exoskeleton flared briefly to crimson before he turned to the nurse. Take him to Zrif. Let him see for himself the futility of this exercise. Zrif lay on a biobot encased in a shimmering medical stasis field. His exoskeleton, once a vibrant emerald green, was dull and cracked, his breathing shallow. Ethan stepped closer, his portable scanner in hand. The Vraxxian nurse beside him folded two of her arms skeptically. Your equipment will detect nothing our systems haven't already identified. Let's find out, Ethan replied, powering on the scanner. He ran it over Zrif's body, frowning as he read the data. The pathogen was aggressive. It spread unchecked by the nanotechnology the Vraxxians had deployed. But there was something else, an irregularity in its behavior that didn't match the progression described in the holographic report. He turned to the nurse. I need a fresh blood sample. You distrust our test, she asked, her exoskeleton flickering to a pale yellow. I prefer to see things for myself. Reluctantly, she handed over a vial of Zrif's blood. Ethan loaded it into his portable analyzer. The machine beeped and whirred, its results appearing on a small screen. Ethan's brow furrowed deeper. There, see that? The nurse leaned in, her multifaceted eyes narrowing. That fluctuation is statistical noise. No, it's a pattern, Ethan corrected. Your systems missed it because it's subtle. The pathogen is responding differently in certain tissues, almost like it's adapting but not uniformly. That means there's a vulnerability. Vraxxian entered the room, his tone dripping with disdain. What nonsense are you spouting now, human? Ethan pointed to the screen. Your nanotech relies on blanket solutions targeting the pathogen as a whole. But this thing's not acting uniformly. It has weak spots. Vraxxian's exoskeleton darkened. Even if that were true, how do you propose we exploit it? With old-fashioned biology, Ethan replied. You've been focusing on killing the pathogen outright. I say we reprogram it. The room fell silent. Even Voxstar seemed momentarily taken aback. Reprogram it? And how do you intend to do that? Ethan pulled out a small syringe from his bag. If we can introduce a targeted viral vector engineered to overwrite its DNA, we can force the pathogen to self-destruct. Voxstar scoffed. Absurd. Your primitive tools couldn't possibly. It's not guesswork if it works, Ethan interrupted. And it will. The procedure was tense. Ethan worked alongside a reluctant team of Vraxxian technicians, guiding them through the process of engineering the viral vector. The Vraxxian equipment was far more advanced than anything Ethan had used before, but its rigid programming required constant adjustments to meet his specifications. Hours later, they administered the treatment. The viral vector was delivered intravenously, designed to target the pathogen's weak spots and dismantle its structure. Zrif's vitals were monitored closely as the minutes ticked by. It started slowly, a stabilization of organ function, a slight improvement in oxygen levels. Then, gradually, the pathogen's presence in Zrif's bloodstream began to diminish. It's working, Ethan said quietly. Voxstar watched the monitors, his exoskeleton shifting to a subdued silver, a sign of awe. I don't understand. How did you see what we could not? Ethan leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Your machines are brilliant, but they're limited. Sometimes you need a pair of eyes that aren't looking for perfection. Just possibility. 2 days later, Zrif was awake and recovering. The Vraxxian Council sent formal gratitude to Earth, and Ethan was offered a position at the Ksorr Medical Citadel, a gesture he politely declined. As he boarded the shuttle back to Earth, Voxstar approached him. You surprised us, Dr. McCall. I'll admit I underestimated you. Ethan grinned. You wouldn't be the first. The hospital lab was a marvel, a seamless union of biology and machinery. The walls seemed alive, pulsating softly as if they were breathing, while sleek robotic arms moved with unnerving precision above floating consoles. Ethan couldn't help rolling his eyes as another one of the arms extended toward him, its sleek appendage hovering like an expectant butler. He shoved it aside and set down his clunky portable spectrometer on an immaculate surface that shimmered faintly under the harsh fluorescent-like glow. You're contaminating the workbench, a voice said, sharp and condescending. Ethan turned to see a Vraxxian lab technician with a wiry frame and a glossy, carapace-like exoskeleton. The alien's name tag read Relics. Its iridescent shell shifted to a pale lavender, which Ethan had come to understand was disdain. Relics surveyed Ethan's equipment as though he'd just unloaded a bag of trash. Relax, sparkle shell. My stuff works just fine, Ethan said without looking up. He pried open the casing of his centrifuge, which had somehow survived 6 years of deep space travel, though the duct tape holding part of it together didn't inspire confidence. It's not pretty, but it gets the job done. Relics hissed softly, a sound that might have been laughter or derision. I failed to see how anything so crude could contribute to the treatment of a pathogen that has already bested the most advanced medical technologies on Vraxxi 7. Ethan didn't bother answering. He grabbed a vial of Zrif's blood sample and slotted it into the centrifuge, muttering under his breath as he jerry-rigged a power adapter to interface with the alien power grid. The machine hummed to life with a grating sound that made Relics flinch. I'm not here to win beauty contests, Ethan said, finally looking up. I'm here to save your big shot, ambassador. You overestimate yourself, human, Relics replied, leaning against the wall with a casual indifference. The pathogen has resisted all attempts at neutralization. Even our AI systems, he gestured to the room's glowing consoles, have deemed it untreatable. Ethan didn't answer, his focus on the centrifuge's output. The pathogen's biochemical signatures scrolled across his tablet in real time. As the data processed, a memory from years ago surfaced in the back of his mind, a rare, nearly forgotten outbreak during his early residency back on Earth. A virus with eerie similarities to this one. He leaned closer, his pulse quickening. Gotcha, he muttered. Relics' head tilted, his multifaceted eyes narrowing. What is it? Ethan turned, holding up the tablet. See this enzyme? The one driving the replication process. Relics stepped closer, his skepticism unwavering. What of it? It's nearly identical to a human enzyme I dealt with once. During an outbreak in the Caribbean, nasty little bug. But the good news is, I know how to stop it. Bold claim, Relic said, his lavender hue deepening. And how exactly do you intend to stop it? Ethan grinned, the excitement of a new challenge taking hold. We build a synthetic inhibitor, a molecule that'll latch onto this enzyme and shut down the replication process. No replication, no pathogen. Relic's silence carried the weight of doubt. And you expect to synthesize such a compound here, in this facility, using your equipment? Ethan tapped his chin theatrically. Well, seeing as how your AI has been about as useful as a paperweight, I figure it's worth a shot. Before Relix could retort, the lab doors hissed open, and a smaller, nervous-looking Vraxxian edged inside. Klekx, Zrif's young assistant, glanced around as if he expected security to burst in at any moment. You called for me? Klekx asked, his voice low. Ethan waved him over. Yeah, I need a favor. A big one. Klexx's exoskeleton shimmered faintly in shades of teal, anxious, if Ethan was reading the color right. What sort of favor? Ethan folded his arms, meeting Klexx's gaze. I need access to Zrif's full medical records. The restricted ones. The AI here won't let me through the firewall. Klexx visibly recoiled. That's highly illegal. I could lose my position. My entire career. Ethan's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. Look, I get it. But if you don't help me, Zrif's not going to make it. And from what I hear, if he doesn't make it, your whole planet's in deep trouble. Klexx hesitated, his hues shifting erratically. Finally, he exhaled a low, clicking sound that might have been Vraxxian for a sigh. Fine, I'll do it. But if anyone finds out... They won't, Ethan promised, already pulling up his tablet to receive the files. You've got my word. As Klexx worked, Relix watched from the corner of the lab, his disdain giving way to something closer to intrigue. You're quite bold, for a human. Boldness is kind of our thing, Ethan replied without looking up. Once the files transferred, Ethan dove into the data. The restricted records included decades of Vraxxian medical research, including failed experiments and unexplored hypotheses. One detail caught his attention: the pathogen's enzyme structure was remarkably sensitive to shifts in its ionic environment. It was a vulnerability the Vraxxian AI had overlooked, likely because it wasn't statistically significant in their models. Ethan grinned. This might actually work. What might work? Relix asked, his tone still skeptical. I've got a blueprint for the inhibitor, Ethan said, pulling up a rough molecular diagram on his tablet. Now we just need to synthesize it. Relix's lavender shifted to gray, a sign of resignation. Very well. Show me what your primitive tools can do. Gladly, Ethan replied, already setting to work. Hours later, the lab was a chaotic blend of Vraxxian elegance and human improvisation. Ethan's equipment whirred and clanked noisily beside the silent efficiency of the alien consoles. At one point, a small explosion erupted from a beaker, sending a plume of green smoke into the air. Relix hissed in alarm, his exoskeleton flaring red as he scrambled to activate the lab's ventilation system. Relax, Ethan said, waving a hand through the dissipating smoke. That's just the reaction I was looking for. You're insufferable, Relix muttered, though there was a grudging respect in his tone. Klexx hovered nearby, his colors shifting between teal and pale orange. How much longer will this take? Ethan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Not long. We're almost there. Finally, the inhibitor was ready, a glowing, amber liquid that shimmered with an almost unnatural brilliance. Ethan held up the vial, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. There it is, the key to saving Zrif. Relix leaned closer, his lavender hue softening. And you're certain this will work? Ethan shrugged. As certain as I can be. Medicine isn't about guarantees, it's about trying anyway. With the inhibitor synthesized, they worked quickly to prepare the delivery mechanism. Relix and Klexx watched in silence as Ethan loaded the compound into a specially modified syringe. Time to see if all this was worth it, Ethan said, heading toward the patient's room. Klexx hesitated, then followed. I hope you're right, human. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I don't hope. I know. Ethan adjusted his gloves, the sterile fabric snug against his skin. The amphitheater-like operating theater loomed around him, its walls lined with tiered observation decks where Vraxxian medical professionals gathered, their carapaces reflecting the soft, bluish light that emanated from the hovering instruments. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the holographic displays projecting Zref's anatomy in hyper-realistic detail above the operating table. Every organ, every pathway and infection site, was illuminated in a web of glowing orange and blue. The synthetic model of Zref's anatomy, a bioengineered marvel floating in a transparent containment field, rotated slowly in the center of the room. Even Ethan had to admit it was impressive. The model pulsed faintly, mimicking real-time biological processes, down to the pathogen's relentless mutation cycles. It was the perfect stand-in for the real thing, a last chance to test his plan before the real procedure. "Are you certain this will work?" Relic stood to Ethan's left, his elongated arms folded as he examined the holographic projections. His lavender hues had shifted to a deep, almost stormy indigo, a mix of concern and skepticism. "Certain?" "No," Ethan said bluntly, his eyes never leaving the model. "Confident?" "Yeah, mostly." Relic's mandibles clicked softly in what Ethan had learned to interpret as exasperation. "Your inability to provide definitive answers is unsettling." Ethan smirked, checking his instruments one last time. "Welcome to medicine, buddy. If you want guarantees, go talk to a mathematician." Before Relix could respond, the doors to the operating theater hissed open, and Dr. Vraxxian entered, his exoskeleton gleaming a sharp, unyielding gold. He stopped a few paces from the operating table, his multifaceted eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "This is madness," Vraxxian announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "What you're proposing is reckless, irresponsible, and borderline barbaric." "And yet here you are," Ethan replied without looking up, calibrating the injector device he'd designed to deliver the synthetic inhibitor alongside targeted electrical impulses to stimulate Zref's immune system. Curious. Vraxxian ignored the jab and stepped closer, his presence radiating authority. "You act as though your crude methods surpass centuries of Vraxxian medical progress." Ethan finally turned to face him, his expression hard. "I'm not saying I'm better. I'm saying I care enough to try what you won't." "That's not care," Vraxxian shot back, his carapace flaring crimson. "It's arrogance." "It's survival," Ethan countered. "You think playing it safe will save him? Sometimes the only way forward is through." The tension in the room was as taut as a surgical wire. The Vraxxian observers in the gallery shifted uneasily, their exoskeletons flickering in a chaotic swirl of hues. For a moment, it seemed as though Vraxxian might order the entire operation shut down. But then Ksorr stepped forward. The young Vraxxian's typically anxious teal hues were now steadier, tinged with the determination Ethan hadn't seen before. "Dr. Vraxxian." Ksorr began, his voice firm but respectful. "I believe we should allow Dr. McCall to proceed. Zref's condition is critical, and no other options remain. Denying this chance would be tantamount to giving up." Vraxxian's gaze shifted to Ksorr, his colors darkening. "You overstep your place, Ksorr." "Perhaps," Ksorr replied, his voice unwavering. "But Zref would not want us to abandon hope." There was a long, heavy silence. Finally, Vraxxian stepped back, his exoskeleton dimming to a resigned gray. "Very well. But know this, human, if you fail, the consequences will be yours alone." "Noted," Ethan said, already turning back to the synthetic model. "Now, if you don't mind, I've got a simulation to run." The first phase of the procedure was painstaking. Ethan worked methodically, guiding the robotic arms as they delivered the synthetic inhibitor into the simulated pathogen clusters on the model. The holographic displays surrounding the operating table updated in real time, showing the inhibitor binding to the pathogen's enzymes and disrupting its replication process. It was working at first. But then the pathogen began to mutate. The glowing orange clusters on the displays shifted, their structure adapting to bypass the inhibitor's effects. Around him, the murmurs of the Vraxxian observers grew louder. "This is what I feared," Relix muttered, his colors dimming. "The pathogen's mutation rate is too high. Your inhibitor cannot keep pace." Ethan gritted his teeth. He had anticipated this, but seeing it unfold in real time was still a gut punch. "The inhibitor was never meant to be a standalone solution," he said, adjusting the parameters on the injector device. "That's where phase 2 comes in." He activated the second delivery mechanism, which sent targeted electrical pulses through the model's simulated immune pathways. The idea was to jumpstart the Vraxxian immune system, forcing it to adapt and respond to the pathogen's energy-based properties, a radical approach that had never been attempted before. The displays shifted again. This time the pathogen clusters began to shrink, their mutation rates slowing as the simulated immune system gained the upper hand. The murmurs in the gallery turned to hushed awe. "It's working," Ksorr said, his eyes wide. "Of course it's working," Ethan muttered, though his hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted the device. "I designed it." Relics tilted his head, his skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. "I must admit your methods are unexpected, but effective." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "High praise coming from you, Sparkle Shell." But then the displays flickered. A new cluster of pathogen activity appeared on the model, this one more aggressive than before. The simulated immune response faltered, unable to keep up with the new mutation. The gallery erupted in a cacophony of clicking and hissing sounds. Vraxxian stepped forward, his exoskeleton blazing red. "You see? This is why we do not gamble with lives." Ethan ignored him, his mind racing. The pathogen's energy-based properties were the key, he was sure of it. But he needed a way to disrupt its energy pathways directly, something that would cripple its ability to adapt without harming the host. And then it hit him. The Vraxxian bioengineering technology, the very system that had created the synthetic model. If he could modify it to deliver a localized energy pulse tuned to the pathogen's specific frequency. He turned to Relics. "I need access to your bioengineering console. Now." Relics hesitated, his colors flickering. "What are you planning?" "Something even crazier than the first two phases," Ethan said, already moving toward the console. "Are you going to help me or not?" After a moment's pause, Relics followed. Together they worked to reprogram the bioengineering system, tuning it to deliver the precise energy pulse Ethan envisioned. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. When the system was ready, Ethan took a deep breath and activated the pulse. The operating theater was bathed in a brief burst of light as the energy surged through the synthetic model. The displays updated. The pathogen clusters disintegrated, their energy pathways collapsing under the pulse. The simulated immune system stabilized, fully eradicating the infection. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the gallery erupted in a wave of alien chatter, their colors flashing in what Ethan could only assume was amazement. "It worked," Ksorr said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. "Damn right it did." Vraxxian stepped forward, his colors subdued. "I still believe your methods were reckless," he said, though there was a begrudging respect in his tone. "But it seems I was wrong to doubt your resolve." Ethan offered a tired smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the Vraxxians began to disperse, Relics turned to Ethan, his lavender hues softening. "For what it's worth, human, you've earned my respect." "Thanks, Sparkle Shell," Ethan replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now let's save the real Zrif." Ethan stood at Zrif's bedside, his back straight but his stomach twisting into tight knots. The sterile air of the recovery room carried an almost oppressive weight, and the faint hum of the medical machinery was the only sound breaking the silence. The real moment had arrived, no simulations, no second chances. Zrif's translucent stasis field shimmered faintly, its energy flickering as the Vraxxians' vitals continued their slow decline. While the alien's once lustrous emerald exoskeleton had dulled to a sickly gray, the holographic monitors above him told the full story. Time was almost out. Ethan set down the injector, now loaded with the inhibitor and prepped for the final stage of the procedure. His hands hovered above it for a moment, steady but hesitant. Ksorr stood to his right, his pale teal hues betraying the deep anxiety coursing through him. "Dr. McCall," Ksorr whispered, glancing nervously at the monitors. "If this doesn't work." "It'll work," Ethan interrupted, though the tension in his voice undercut the confidence of his words. "Sometimes, the hardest part of medicine isn't knowing what to do, it's having the guts to do it." Ksorr blinked, his hues flickering between teal and orange as he processed the statement. "Your people have strange sayings." "You'll get used to them," Ethan managed a crooked smile. "Now hold Zrif steady while I initiate this." On the far side of the room, Dr. Vraxxian watched with arms folded, his exoskeleton a simmering mix of orange and gray. He had objected up to the very last moment but had reluctantly agreed to oversee the procedure once it became clear no other options remained. Despite his earlier skepticism, his multifaceted eyes betrayed the faintest hint of curiosity. The injector device whirred softly as Ethan adjusted its settings. The synthetic inhibitor would be released in controlled intervals, synchronized with the energy pulses that would jumpstart Zrif's immune system. But the risks were immense. The pathogen's volatile nature meant any deviation could cause a catastrophic chain reaction. "Are you hesitating?" Human Vraxxian's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "Not hesitating." Thinking, Ethan shot back, not bothering to look up. "Some of us like to double-check before plunging ahead. Some might call that doubt." "Call it what you want," Ethan said, pressing the injector against Zrif's vascular port. "I call it making sure I don't kill your guy on accident." Ksorr flinched at the bluntness, but Vraxxian said nothing. Ethan activated the injector, and the inhibitor began its slow release. Zrif's body twitched faintly, his muscles spasming under the stasis field. The monitors above him flickered, showing a minute rise in his oxygen levels. "That's the first step," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the tension crackling through him. "Now comes the hard part." He turned to the console, where the bioengineered energy pulse system had been recalibrated based on the results of the simulation. The pathogen had been adapting at an alarming rate, but Ethan's adjustments would target its specific energy pathways, shutting down its ability to mutate. If it worked, Zrif's immune system would take over and eliminate the remaining traces of the infection. If it didn't, it would work. It had to. Ethan's fingers moved deftly across the console, inputting the final parameters. The device powered up, a low hum rising in pitch as it prepared to deliver the first pulse. He glanced at Ksorr, who was gripping the edge of the bed tightly with two of his arms. "Ready?" Ethan asked. "No," Ksorr admitted, his hues oscillating wildly. "But proceed anyway." "Good answer," Ethan muttered, pressing the activation key. A sharp, resonating hum filled the room as the energy pulse surged through Zrif's body. The alien's exoskeleton flared briefly with a faint green light, then settled back into its dull gray. The monitors above him showed an immediate reaction. The pathogen clusters in his bloodstream flickered, their structures destabilizing. "It's working," Ksorr said, his voice almost disbelieving. "Don't celebrate yet," Ethan cautioned, his eyes fixed on the data streaming across the displays. "We've still got 3 more pulses to go." He triggered the second pulse, then the third. Each time, Zrif's vitals showed incremental improvement, his oxygen levels stabilizing and his organ functions beginning to recover. But with the final pulse came an unexpected complication: an abrupt spike in Zrif's heart rate, followed by erratic fluctuations in his neural activity. "What's happening?" Ksorr demanded, his hues flashing a panicked yellow. "The pathogen's not going quietly," Ethan said, his voice tight. "It's trying to adapt to the energy pulses, scrambling its structure to resist the immune response." "Then it's failing," Vraxxian said, stepping closer to the monitors. His tone was calmer than before, but his hues remained a stormy orange. "The immune system is still gaining ground." "For now," Ethan said, already recalibrating the energy pulse frequency for one last unplanned blast. "But if we don't hit it again before it stabilizes, it could outpace the immune system entirely." Vraxxian hesitated, then moved to the other side of the console. "What do you need?" Ethan glanced at him, surprised by the offer but not wasting time to question it. "Adjust this to increase power output by 5%. Any higher, and we risk damaging his healthy cells." Vraxxian nodded, his long fingers moving quickly over the controls. For the first time, there was no trace of disdain in his movements, only focus. The final pulse was ready. Ethan's hand hovered over the activation key, his gut twisting. This was it. No more simulations, no more adjustments. Either it worked, or it didn't. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, pressing the key. The hum reached a crescendo as the energy pulse surged through Zrif's body. His exoskeleton flared again, brighter this time, and the pathogen clusters on the monitors began to collapse entirely. The erratic spikes in his neural activity stabilized, his heart rate leveling out. Slowly, surely, the infection cleared. The room was still, save for the soft beeping of the monitors. Zrif's vitals had stabilized fully, his oxygen levels holding steady. The faint green tint of his exoskeleton began to return, though it was muted, as if he were waking from a long, harrowing dream. Ethan exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. We did it! Klexex let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, his hues shifting to a vibrant orange, a color Ethan had learned to associate with joy. He's recovering. You actually did it. Voxstar stood silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the monitors. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. You may be reckless, human, but you are not incompetent. I'll take it, Ethan said, too tired to argue. As he stepped back, Zref's eyes opened slowly, his multifaceted gaze focusing on Ethan. His voice was faint but clear. Your methods. They were unorthodox, but they saved me. Your people are. More capable than we gave credit. Ethan smiled, his exhaustion tempered by a quiet pride. Glad I could prove you wrong. The recovery room fell into a stillness that was almost serene. Outside the window, the alien landscape stretched endlessly, vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the sterile chaos they had just endured. Ethan knew he'd be heading back to Earth soon, but he left behind something more valuable than his presence, a new way of thinking, and the hope that sometimes even the unorthodox could lead to salvation.